Welcome, listeners, to the Running Mates podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Comstock, and today we have a very special guest, Christopher Purdy, CEO of the Chamberlain Network, here today to discuss with us the current Iran conflict and the perspective of veterans and the U.S. military on what is going on. Today is the 20th day of the conflict, which began on February 28th after a series of major decapitation strikes by the United States that decimated Iranian leadership. Iran has responded in kind with attacks on energy infrastructure around the Middle East and shutting the Straits of Hormuz. The straits remain closed, and currently the conflict is still escalating. Within the last 24 hours, Israel has struck the South Pars LNG field, which is a major red line for natural gas and energy production in the region. Currently, we see escalation continue on both sides, and right now we don't see a way out militarily, at least in the near future. Chris, thank you so much for joining us. In your work and in your service as a veteran, what were your first thoughts when you saw news of this conflict on February 28th?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. Thanks for having me. I think there's two ways to answer that question. One is a veteran. I served in Iraq. Today, actually, is the 23rd anniversary of the invasion of Iraq. And I think a lot about that conflict and the damage that it did to our own country, not to mention the region, the instability of the region that it caused, ironically leading to a power vacuum that Iran took advantage of and have kind of led us to this point. But in our own country, that war was started on a lie. The Bush administration was incredibly dishonest about Saddam Hussein's pursuit of weapons of mass destruction, and that led to a whole bunch of domestic political issues over the past 20 years. Lack of trust in government. You could really probably point to where we are right now politically in this country and draw a line from the invasion of Iraq to today. People just didn't believe their government was looking out for them. So I think about that. I think about how our allies have essentially abandoned us for good reason. 6 months ago, not even 6 months ago, January, we were threatening to invade Greenland, and now our NATO allies are refusing to come to support this war. So I just think that this war is an encapsulation of everything that is wrong in this current moment, both domestically and internationally. It's unfortunate that we are in this conflict. There's no reason for it, and I'm hoping that this can end as quickly as possible.
The parallels between the invasion of Iraq and this current conflict are so striking. Both the Trump administration and the Bush administration, they're a lot more similar than they are different, I think. But the scale of the conflict and the speed with which this is escalated is really unprecedented. You were quoted in Politico not too long ago with a line where you described this as, "This current conflict makes the Iraq war planning look like grand strategy." Can you unpack that a little bit more?
So if you remember, back in 2002, the Bush administration spent an entire year building an international case for an invasion of Iraq. Their goal was to make this as legitimate internationally as possible. They went to the UN Security Council. The famous picture of Colin Powell there, essentially giving inaccurate information to the Security Council. So that took an entire year to do. And to their credit, the actual tactical invasion of Iraq was quite good. I mean, I think it was less than a month, and we'd taken over the entire country. We'd started the occupation, but then they hadn't thought of what comes next. This conflict seemed to just came out of nowhere. Popped up at the beginning of the new year when we brought in aircraft carrier to the region. No real planning for the economic warfare that Iran was prepared to wage, not a real understanding of how drone warfare had changed, and the Iranians becoming one of the best in the world, second probably really to Russia and Ukraine. No understanding of the need to have allies in a conflict like this. It is pure amateur hour on the part of this administration, and I think it's no surprise because the folks who are leading this administration, whether it's the president or Secretary of Defense Hegseth, have shown an utter disdain for people who understand strategy at the broad level, understand how planning, understand anything beyond just the immediate tactical level. So the two conflicts from that perspective couldn't be any more different. What is the same is that they're unpopular wars. Their justification is based on a lie, and if Iraq was any indication of how well regime change is going to go for us in the region, I'm scared to think of what Iran's going to look like.
When they do polling in the United States of what institutions Americans put the most trust in, usually elected members of Congress rank near the bottom, and like the post office is somewhere in the middle. But usually the most well-respected or trusted institution is the United States military. And I would think that for most people, they equate the U.S. military and its branches as an entity distinct from the current presidential administration. So you have Donald Trump and like Pete Hegseth and renaming the Department of Defense to the Department of War. But I think most people would still assume that like the United States military is this extremely competent and professional organization that holds itself to a high standard. But we've also had 10 years essentially between these two Trump administrations of erosion of norms and sort of corruption. And it's really, at a breaking point now. From your perspective, have you seen any changes in the veteran community or in the active military community?
So the military is a professional organization. We remain the premier armed forces in the world and the history of the world. That's not an exaggeration to say that we are the most competent, most professional, highly trained, most well-funded, most effective military that has ever it's wild to say this, that is ever engaged in combat on the planet Earth. That being said, the reason for that is because the military is a meritocracy. It is where professionalism and competency are rewarded above political ideology, and it's because it's apolitical. What we've seen over the last year is the Trump administration attempting, under the guise of accountability for the failure in Iraq and Afghanistan and some other ideological reasons, they've kind of cleaned house. And at the senior level, they fired many of the Joint Chiefs. C.Q. Brown, who was the chief of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. They've removed the Judge Advocates General, whose job it is to interpret what orders are legal or illegal. And this is really important when you're targeting buildings for airstrikes. You need to be able to have somebody who's there to say like, oh no, it is illegal to bomb a girls' school. And if your information is out of date, you need to go and double check before you make that strike. Or it's illegal to bomb an enemy who's surrendering. This idea of no quarter, no surrender that Secretary of Defense Hegseth put out earlier this week is a war crime. And I hope that when this administration passes on, that absent any pardon from the president, that Secretary Hegseth and the people who are pushing this narrative, no quarter, no surrender, are tried for war crimes, because that's illegal. And the reason the military has been so successful over the past 100 years is because we've held ourselves to standards. And it doesn't feel good to say that a standard might be restricting our ability to wage combat. But in order to prevent things like the massacre at My Lai, or recently the massacre in Haditha in 2006 in Iraq, the military has had to build in these guardrails. So I think if you're asking me, what do I see in the military? I see folks that are coming out of the military. They're frustrated because they see the armed forces becoming more politicized, learning all the wrong lessons of the global war on terror, and that's not even to mention the attacks on the troops themselves that this administration has initiated. Tens of thousands of trans service members removed simply because of who they are. That's going to have an effect on our military. Now, thankfully, it's going to take a long time to get through. These types of changes do not happen overnight. You mentioned we're 10 years into the Trump era. That is true, but really the high intensity pressure on the military has only come about in the past 10 to 12 months.
Interesting. So it's only been in that shorter period of time that the political attention has been moved towards the apolitical military leadership.
Sure, yeah. So in the first administration, you had Secretary of Defense Mattis, who was an institutionalist. He's probably one of the greatest generals of our era. He understood what made the military great. And then you had a succession of increasingly more kind of partisan and ideological secretaries of defense, but they all understood that in order to have a successful military, it has to be independent. You can't make it political. 2020, at the height of the George Floyd protests that summer, when you had the president demanding that the military come in and shoot protesters, you had ideologues in DOD saying, no, we're not going to do that because that's not the military's job. There has been a concerted effort since they came in this time around to put people who are unscrupulous in charge, and those people have no qualms about breaking the law. Now, we've yet to see them, blatantly defy a Supreme Court order, but we're a year in. We've got 3 more to go. We have had a number of conflicts over the last year, so there's a lot of time left.
Now, speaking of illegality, I did want to put a pin in something that you said just a few minutes ago. Is it really true that Pete Hegseth getting up and saying those things, no mercy, no quarter, that alone, just that announcement, is criminal or would be a war crime?
If it was an order to troops, if he was actually saying that to interpret, to send that out to his troops and anticipating and expecting that members of the military follow that is a war crime. He is the leader of the military. It is illegal, and he's liable for prosecution for that. Daniel Maurer, who's a well-respected former judge advocate general, is currently teaching at the University of Ohio, wrote a fictional memo to Secretary Hegseth after that interview, explaining the exposure that those comments have to him from a criminal liability standpoint. So the secretary needs to understand he's not a talking head on TV anymore. It might have felt good to say that on Fox News, but he is the commander of our nation's military. Yes, the president is the commander-in-chief, but he is the one who is interpreting the commander-in-chief orders and executing it in DOD. And if he's getting on TV and telling his troops no quarter, no surrender, that is very dangerous and should be looked at as a war crime.
Goodness. It makes sense when you put it that way. He is like at a podium and he is the boss of that thing. So it is, how do you not interpret that as an order if that is, the words coming out of his mouth? That's pretty crazy. Speaking more towards this erosion of our democracy, can you tell me more about the Chamberlain Network's work?
Yeah, so I had previously done veteran organizing on international human rights, had done a lot of work on immigration and refugees, had worked incredibly closely on the Afghan evacuation, was involved in that, and before it was even on anyone's radar. And then in 2024, I took a look around and said, these issues are incredibly important. Refugees are important. Human rights are important. But if we don't have a functioning democracy, none of that matters. And so the team and I sat down and we said, I think we want to start this new initiative focused on democracy protection. And the idea being, as you said earlier, that veterans are one of the most respected voices in the nation. How do we use that voice to rebuild trust and faith in our democratic institutions? And so what we do is we train veterans on how to become advocates in their community in a nonpartisan way, but how to organize coalitions in their community, how to reach out to the members of the state house and the state senate and city council members. There's some work that can be done at the federal level. But ultimately, our theory of change rests on if we can mobilize people locally to believe in their institutions, that will have a bubbling up impact in people's belief and understanding that democracy can work. At the same time, we're also organizing groups at the national level. We consider from the micro at the individual veteran at the local level to the macro of organizations doing things like pushing back on the National Guard deployments, pushing back on the cuts to VA and the dismantling of the federal government, all these different things that are being done in the name of the American people, but actually the American people didn't vote for that, right? Or the people's representatives didn't authorize that, which is really how we exercise democracy in this country. So we do a lot of coalition work, and we feel like between those two tracks of national coalition organizing and individual veteran training and advocacy, that we might be able to kind of get this country a little bit more on the right track.
What are the biggest issues that the people coming to the Chamberlain Network, like what is causing that veteran to come to speak to someone at the Chamberlain Network?
Yeah, so we do our organizing work through 3 different pillars: free and fair elections, healthy civic culture, and healthy democratic institutions. And so when veterans come to us, we ask them to kind of like frame whatever it is they're looking for through one of those three things. Elections are a big issue. Just from a kind of a planning cycle, we focus on elections every other year because that's when we have elections, right? Or that's when we have national elections, I should say. Georgia knows that we have elections early and often.
Early and often is right. A lot of double checking.
Exactly. But so, like, this year people are very concerned about things like the SAVE Act and seeing DHS or ICE or the National Guard at their election stations, or they're concerned about their local clerks, if they're going to have enough people to be supported during the election cycle. And so what we're doing is we're helping veterans think about what they can do to move the needle on these issues. So we'll talk about the SAVE Act. So the SAVE Act is a bill that's working its way through Congress. And it basically would force people to have their birth certificate or their passport to prove their identity, to prove their citizenship, really, even though only 30% of the Americans have a passport. And so we have a guy in Connecticut who's organizing a passport drive for his community. He thinks that one of the ways that he can act as a check if this bill actually does pass is that everyone in his community has to have a passport. Another project that we're doing is we are organizing efforts around the election to bring a sense of joy and safety and security by bringing veterans and faith leaders and lawyers out on election day to encourage people to vote, to monitor the elections, not in the sense that, whether they, like the Carter Center has a whole project on free and fair elections, but really just to kind of observe and see what's happening. Is ICE at the polls? Are the National Guard out there? And to provide a bulwark against some of these intimidation tactics. So those are some of the projects that we're doing. We also do a lot of storytelling, teaching veterans how to tell their story, because we find that advocacy through storytelling is one of the most effective ways to go about that.
When it comes to the SAVE Act, on the flip side, from where you are sitting, what is your worst fear? What do you think the worst case scenario could happen if our democracy continues to erode, if the SAVE Act is passed? What keeps you up at night?
Well, so the SAVE Act is trying to solve problems that don't exist. Many states have figured out ways to, prove the citizenship of their voters without having to have this burdensome mechanism. West Virginia is able to do it, and if West Virginia can do it, I guarantee you everybody can do it. And no knock against West Virginia, but states have figured this out. So what it's trying to do is it's trying to make it more difficult to vote. And so that's the problem with the SAVE Act, or at least that's what would happen if the SAVE Act were to pass. What is my worst case scenario? I am very concerned about misinformation in the lead up to the election. I'm concerned about how AI can be used. This is nothing new, right? I'm not breaking any news here, but it could be used to dissuade people or lie to people about whether what's happening in their elections. On election day, I am concerned about actual attacks on infrastructure by non-state actors, left and right, given kind of where we are in this country. I'm also concerned about state actors using their presence to dissuade people from vote. I mentioned that the elections project that we have coming up is designed to get people to feel safe at the polls. But if look at Minneapolis, they had 2,000 ICE agents came out. People were afraid to leave their homes. They were afraid to go to get the groceries. My wife is a naturalized citizen. She was in Atlanta, is still walking around with a copy of her passport. And that's just daily life. And then you layer that on top of there's election. Everyone knows the outcome that the president wants in this election. And that could dissuade people from voting. And even if one person is dissuaded from voting because ICE or the National Guard or DHS was out on the street, that's a problem. That's disenfranchisement, and there's no recourse in the courts to fight against that, right? It's not that it's illegal. It's just that there's the Supreme Court basically say, okay, so people didn't show up to vote, we can't do anything about that, right? So that's a concern. And then the final thing that keeps me up at night is post-certification or post-election during the certification process. Speaker Johnson has already shown a willingness to delay and withhold seating members to fit his political objectives. We saw in the fall, a representative from, I believe it was Arizona, was not seated because she would have been the deciding vote in the Epstein Files case. So I'm very concerned about whether members who were legitimately elected will be allowed to take their seats. You asked me what keeps me up at night. This is what keeps me up at night. But we're working hard to prevent that. And civil society I was just on a call earlier today with 36 groups of major organizations thinking about these issues, these really difficult issues. So that's what really gives me hope. People aren't just sitting around waiting for this to happen. People are actually actively planning and working towards a better solution.
Well, that's really good to hear, because I think I can speak for myself, but I know many people feel this way. The current conditions for the election in the fall are now very favorable to Democrats. And I'm always kind of fascinated by the questions posed by the SAVE Act. Because there's sort of a joke of if you needed just a passport to vote, like a driver's license wouldn't work, but a passport would only vote, it would be overwhelmingly Democrat or overwhelmingly liberal in who would actually be casting votes if you look at who does and does not have the proper identification by their standards.
A military ID would not count as documentary proof of citizenship. As if people who changed their name but didn't fully kind of go through the process would not be allowed to vote, because they might have some documents with one name and another. Like, this hits close to me. My mother changed her name back in the 90s. And then only realized it when she was going to, so she hyphenated her last name between her maiden and married name, and only realized that she never completed the process, like 2 or 3 years ago when she was going to collect Social Security. And so she had been operating for 30 years. Driver's license name was changed, right? And so she would have been affected under this documentary proof of citizenship law if it does go into effect. During that time, she would have been affected. But she's a legal American citizen and shouldn't be denied the right to vote because of these things. Anyways, we could talk I know we want to talk about Iran, but I'm happy to talk about domestic issues as well. I like doing a bit of both.
Can you take me through your story and your service and how you came to be where you are today?
Well, it was a dark and stormy night, right? Yeah, so I was born in upstate Western New York, in Rochester, New York. My father is an Irish immigrant. He came over as a kid. We moved actually to Great Britain when I was a kid and spent some of my most formative years there. My father's from Northern Ireland. We took many vacations to Belfast in the 90s, which, if your listeners would recall, was not the best place to be. The British Army occupied Northern Ireland for, it's still a British Commonwealth, but the British Army itself was there for 30 years. And I have vivid memories of seeing my father being arrested and detained by British Army soldiers.
Really?
I was right next to him one time when we were walking down the street, and 2 trucks came up and took his camera, and it was a whole thing. So I have this sense that the military can be misused against its own people. But after 9/11, I believe so much in this country and the ideals of this country that I decided to enlist. And so I enlisted while I was in college in the National Guard, continued my college degree, became a teacher, eventually deployed with the National Guard to Iraq in 2011. Got out in 2012 and spent a couple years trying to figure out what I wanted to do. And it was at that point in 2016 when I decided I think I want to get into veteran advocacy. It wasn't until about 4 or 5 years after I got out of the military that I actually really felt comfortable being a veteran. Because that, I think folks who've never gone through this process, that's not an easy thing for them to understand, that you have this identity within the military. And then when you leave, it goes away. Like, you have to create this whole new identity after you get out of service, and you're hanging out with people you're in the same class of people who fought in World War II, or were in Germany during the Cold War, or were with you in Iraq, and you have to make sense of what it means to be outside of the armed forces. So it took me some time, but I started working at Human Rights First at a program called Veterans for American Ideals. Which is, as I mentioned earlier, was about using the veteran voice to support refugees and immigrants and human rights. And I eventually took that program over. I led it for about 4 or 5 years. And then, in 2024, started the Chamberlain Network. That's my story.
And here we are today.
Here we are. And if it wasn't for that donkey, I wouldn't have made it through senior year.
One of the things that I've been thinking of a lot in the last 2 weeks that you brought up in your own story is how you were inspired by 9/11 to join the military or to get involved. And I think for a lot of people who weren't alive at that time, that real sense of patriotism and a deep want or need to like get involved or to sacrifice or to help your fellow citizen was so palpable in the United States at that time. And I think it's a legacy of the Iraq War and later on, but that sense does not seem to be present at all in 2026. And I wondered if you had any thoughts about that when it comes to supporting this conflict or a sense of national sacrifice, because one way or another, we're going to be feeling it here in the United States, whether it's through a longer military deployment or through higher gas prices. But I think people are not willing to sacrifice for that political change in the Middle East.
And what would they be sacrificing it for? World War II, we understood we were going to liberate Europe from fascism. The Civil War, we understood at some level that we were there to unify the nation and end the scourge of slavery. After 9/11, 3,000 Americans died in an attack, what many Americans saw as an unprovoked attack on the homeland. So there was absolutely a sense that there was a need to sacrifice. No one sees the need to sacrifice anything here. The Iranians, the Iranian regime is bad. Okay, got it. So is North Korea. So is Russia. The Chinese are no friends, right? You can throw a dart at the map and find a dozen countries that are bad. The Iranians did carry out attacks during the Global War on Terror on American service members. That is a fact. That war ended 15 years ago. At least the active combat did. So I don't see why the average American would look at this conflict and say, yeah, I'm willing to send my son and daughter, or I'm willing to go overseas to do it. So there's that part of it. The other part of it, though, is because, and I think I mentioned this earlier, because today is the anniversary of the war in Iraq, Americans have seen their country lie to them over and over and over again when it comes to foreign entanglements. Right? We were lied and tricked into going to Vietnam. We were lied and tricked into going to Iraq. And it might take Americans a while, but we figure things out. And if we suspect that our government is not being honest with us, that's going to cause people to not believe in the system. And the system, I say that democracy is like fairy dust. It only works if people believe in it. And if you keep sending people down this path and costing them not just their pride or their economic value, but actually the lives of their children, that's going to cause them to not believe in the system anymore. And it's going to break our country. So I'm very concerned about where this leads domestically as much as I am internationally.
It's very sobering, and I totally agree with the sentiment. How do you see this current conflict ending? Where do you think we're going in the next 3 weeks and then in the next 3 months?
Well, there's a few different options. I am not an expert in the Middle East by any imagination, but just looking at this, one option is he walks away. He declares victory, and leaves Iran smoldering, and then from there, God knows what's going to happen, right? That's essentially what we did in Afghanistan in the late 80s after the Soviets left. The international community left that country to become the haven for Al-Qaeda. So we could just leave, but the difference between Afghanistan and Iran is the economic pressure that they are able to exert, and they will exert that pressure if they're not forced to end it. The other thing is that this just becomes an ulcer. You just keep, kind of like what we did to the Houthis in Yemen, we just keep striking them over and over and over and over again until we run out of ammunition. Depending on the sources that you read, we might be running out of ammunition. It's quite possible that over the next couple of weeks, we could see our ability to intercept these drones go down, because what the Iranians are doing is they're sending over what is essentially a lawnmower with wings and a little bomb strapped to it. Costs a couple $20,000 to make. We're shooting these down with missiles that cost millions of dollars and months to make. We only have so much of a supply to that. The third option, which I hope I am correct, I might be wrong, but I hope I'm correct, is the most unlikely, is that we actually send in massive ground forces to do a regime change a la Iraq and Afghanistan 2001, 2003. I don't see how Congress authorizes that at all. That's not to say this president wouldn't do it, but you would need, in Iraq we had 500,000 troops at the height, I think, is what it was, or maybe not. It wasn't 500,000. I think it was. I'm going to get the numbers wrong, so I'm just not even going to try. But you're going to need hundreds of thousands of troops to occupy and pacify that country. I hope it doesn't come to that. I'm also concerned about the resources that we are expending on Iran and the damage this is doing to our allies, our European allies, the reputational impacts that we're having. Could this impact NATO? Absolutely. If the Trump administration invokes Article 5, what happens if the NATO partners say, actually, this is not an Article 5 moment, we're not going to do it? Does that fracture the alliance? Maybe. What happens in Taiwan when the Chinese understand that we have a limited stockpile to support the Taiwanese, and they just go all out in an invasion? Can we carry this on? There's international instability in every one of these paths, and we just need to be prepared for it.
You mentioned just a second ago the role of Congress in this, and I'd really like your take on what the Congress should be doing, and then I suppose what Democrats in particular should be doing, because I believe the Pentagon has requested $200 billion to help fund this ongoing conflict. And some of the more outspoken Democrat, senators and congressmen have said, I am not going to vote for this authorization. Is that the only lever that Congress has at this moment, is just the power of the purse? Or are there other developments that could be used?
Well, it's not just Democrats that have said that they're not going to support this. Republican senators have come out, and so I think $200 billion for a war that no one wants is dead on arrival in the Senate. I mean, maybe they'll get it through. They've been known to strong arm their way. We'll see. They have a contentious DHS hearing that they're trying to work through right now, anyways. So the Senate has a lot on its plate. But beyond just refusing to fund the war, which they should do, they should refuse to fund the war. I think they passed the largest Defense Authorization Act in history last year. So there's plenty of resources if the president feels like he needs them. But what Congress should do is vote on declaration of war if we're going to go that route. We haven't had declaration of war since World War II. Since Korea, we've been voting on what are called authorizations of use of military force, which is basically Congress saying, we approve of the president to send troops to do this kind of policing action. So they should vote on what's called an AUMF, right? Authorization of use of military force. That needs to be voted on, needs to be debated. The president needs to make the case to the American people and to their elected representatives, because the founding generation, they understood that war needed to be debated, and you need to have consensus among the whole country in order to go to war, which is why they put that power to go to war in the hands of the people's elected representatives in the House and the Senate. They've abandoned their responsibility on this. The 2 war powers resolutions came up, both were voted down, and this is not just a problem on the Republican side. You have Senator Fetterman from Pennsylvania saying that he would vote to authorize this war. That's his choice, but at the very least, we need to be voting for these bills and taking a lesson from what our founding generation encouraged us to do when it came to conflict, because the lack of courage on both sides of the aisle of taking their responsibility to lead this country into war or to peace, they've just abandoned it. And it's really unfortunate that Congress has abdicated its responsibility on this issue.
When you think about it, I mean, when the Congress was set up by the founding fathers, issues of sovereign governments were war and peace and diplomacy and trade. I mean, war being way up there, way more than naming post offices and the culture war stuff that seems to bring down the political debate these days.
Yeah, I mean, that was a huge thing on their mind. I mean, this is the stuff of kings and princes to be able to declare war unilaterally. The founding generation understood that this needed to be a whole country endeavor, that you can't just send people into war on the whims of an individual. So the fact that Congress has given up that responsibility and they seem more interested in staying in elected office as long as possible rather than actually leading this country is a problem. And again, this is not a Republican issue. Democrats have done it too. So what I'm hopeful for in this upcoming cycle is that we have people from both parties who are willing to stand up for the job that they're actually running for. If you are running for Congress, act like a member of Congress. Push hard votes. Make decisions. You cannot just let a president make the rules here.
Now, what do you think that we as citizens should be doing? What from your perspective, what's the most important thing that listeners can do to get involved or to advocate for?
So, I advocate for the things that I think are important. What your listeners want to advocate for, I think Each individual needs to make that decision for themselves. We have big issues facing this country, and everyone wants to focus on the national issues. We talked about two major things, international and domestic, here on this call, with the SAVE Act domestically and the war in Iran internationally. But ultimately, your power is as a voter or as a citizen is more felt at the local level. Getting your states and your cities and your communities to implement positive changes that can benefit you immediately, that is really powerful. I'm going to be very honest with you. One of your individual listeners here is not going to be able to stop the war in Iran. As much as we would like that to happen, right? An individual listener is not going to be able to stop the SAVE Act from disenfranchising millions of Americans. But they can do something in their own way to make their community better. So if they don't know, at the very minimum, they should understand who their municipal government is. Town, city councils, mayors. Who's your public service commission in the state? Who's your elected representative at the state house? And then reach out to them to see what's going on in my community that I can make an impact. You don't need to reach out to your city council person on the war in Iran. There's nothing they can do about that. It's unfortunate. And I was reminded of this in November of this year when Mamdani was elected in November in New York City. And the Secretary of State of Kentucky put out a message on Twitter encouraging people to stop calling him and asking him how they could vote against or for Mamdani because Kentucky is not New York City. So that type of civic literacy is really what we need more of. And if your listeners could just do that little thing, right? Just do that little thing of understanding who your elected officials are and contacting them. It doesn't matter if it's a pothole or here in Atlanta, the city council is pushing through an open container law in parts of the city. Talk to them about that. Talk about the bike lanes that they're putting in. Are you for them or against them? I personally am for bike lanes because I have a bike. Those little things are really what makes our democracy function.
Chris, that was an excellent sign off. Thank you so much for your time today, and thank you for joining us. Where can we find you, and how can we find out more about the Chamberlain Network?
Yeah, well, you can find the Chamberlain Network at chamberlainnetwork.us, and we are on pretty much every social media except TikTok. Our handle is generally at Chamberlain Vets. So come and send us a note. We have monthly leadership calls. You can find out about them on our social media. We're having one tonight on March 19th. I know this will probably air later, but we'd love to have you.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you so much, and we will see you later. Right. Bye-bye.
Thanks.